He placed the silver cloak on her sister's shoulders and never looked at her again. She stood in the back of the great hall carrying his child. He chose the safe queen, the clean alliance, the throne. So she walked into the storm alone, a brutal wolf kingdom, a cursed bloodline, an alpha king who traded something real for something he could control. By ancient law, she was nothing. By blood, she carried everything. 18 winters, no crown, no army, only a bone-handled knife and 2 amber-eyed children built by the wild. Then the fires came north, soldiers on the ridge, the king on his knees in ash-burning forests, howling wolves. A broken sword, driven into stone where she'd stood. He underestimated her. Once, the mountain remembered what the throne forgot. You gave up something you didn't know existed. The great hall of Valdemar had been built for authority, not comfort. The ceilings vaulted 40 feet above the floor, designed to make every voice that spoke from the dais sound like it originated somewhere between the earth and a higher power. The architects had understood their assignment. The stone absorbed warmth and returned cold, which meant that the 300 wolves to roll hacked shoulder to shoulder for the solstice rite were generating enough collective body heat to fog the upper windows while the floor remained freezing. Incense burned from iron censers suspended on chains, frankincense and charred rosemary, layered so heavily that the back of the throat tasted it before the nose registered it. The priests burned too much every year. They believed, apparently, that enough smoke could sanctify anything. What it actually did was sit on top of the existing atmosphere without replacing it. Roasted venison and sour ale and damp wool, and the sharp metallic edge of territorial anxiety that 400 years of pack politics had ground into the very stones of this building. Rowan stood near the back, her spine pressed against a rough-hewn pillar. She had arrived early enough to claim this specific position. Not from sentiment, not from any strategic intention, but from the habit of 18 years of fieldwork that made her automatically locate the point in any room where her back was covered, and her sightlines were clear. She could see the dais from here. She could see the main entrance and both side doors. She could see, if she turned slightly, the Campfire passage that ran behind the eastern wall toward the lower corridors. She was not dressed for the occasion. The silk gown that had been delivered to her chamber 3 days ago was still hanging where she'd left it, untouched, still wrapped in the cloth the seamstress had used to transport it. Rowan had looked at it for a long moment on the afternoon of delivery, and then gone back to sharpening her short sword, which had needed attention since the last patrol and was not going to sharpen itself. The linen dress she was wearing had been washed since then. That was the extent of her concessions to the evening. She pressed her left hand flat against her stomach, just for a moment. Just long enough to register the low warmth that had settled there over the past weeks, the heaviness that had no other explanation. She had been doing the accounting in her head for a month. Now the dates, the timing, the implications. The outing point were complete, and the conclusion was clear, and she had not yet decided how to begin the conversation it required. Tonight had seemed like the wrong time. Now, looking at the dais, she thought it might have been the only time. On the platform at the front of the hall, Calder stood. He was 34 years old, and had been Alpha King for 5 of them, and the 5 years showed in specific ways that the 11 years before hadn't. Not in the body, he was still the largest person in any room he entered, still moved with the physical authority of a man who had spent his entire life being the strongest thing present. It showed in the face. In the 3 additional lines at the corners of his eyes that hadn't been there at his coronation. In the way his jaw carried a tension that didn't release, even when he was nominally at rest. In the silver that had begun appearing at his temples sometime in the 3rd year of his reign, when the Eastern Lords had formed the alliance that took 14 years to dismantle without triggering another war. He was wearing ceremonial furs, the pelt of a dire bear killed by his own hand in the first winter, when 3 of the Northern Lords had decided to test the new king's tolerance for dissent. He had gone into the Northern Territory alone, which nobody had advised, and had come back with the bear pelt, and a new scar along his jaw, and a reputation that had not required testings, since the binding cloak was in his hands. Spun silver thread through white fox fur, the weight and shimmer of it catching the torchlight from every angle simultaneously. Knew his scent from across the hall. She had learned it over 3 years of proximity, pine resin, and crushed mint, and the deeper rust and iron undertone of his dominance. The scent that intensified when he was working through a problem, and softened into something warmer and less guarded when they were alone. She had spent 3 years telling herself that she understood what that scent meant, that the understanding was mutual, that the thing they had, late evenings in the outer stables, far from the council chambers and the watching political machinery of the court, constituted something that existed on both sides of it. Calder's eyes moved across the crowd, systematic, the way he scanned unfamiliar terrain, not looking for welcome, looking for variables. His gaze moved across the front of the hall, the middle, the back, and stopped. For the duration of one full breath, his eyes found hers. The amber in them changed, a quick deepening, the way a coal brightens when air hits it suddenly. The muscle along his jaw moved once. He saw her. He registered her. He registered. She understood in that moment with a clarity that arrived too late to be useful, more than she had told him, because Calder always been a better reader of people than he allowed us to believe. Then he looked away. Not gradually, not reluctantly. He turned his gaze with the deliberate precision of a man completing an action he had already decided to take, and ran the severance of it in her sternum, the way you felt a change in air pressure. Not a sound, not a pain, but a difference in the quality of the atmosphere that the body registered before the mind caught up. He stepped down from the dais, his boots struck the dried rushes on the floor with a sound like each step was a decision being finalized. The crowd parted ahead of him without being asked. It always had. He moved through the hall, in a straight line, and the line ended in front of Rowan's younger sister, Iselin, who was standing 12 feet from Rowan with her eyes cast toward the floor, and her shoulders drawn inward, and her hands folded in front of her in the posture of someone who had been told what was going to happen, and had consented to it, because the architecture of her situation had not offered her a meaningful alternative. Iselin smelled of crushed lavender and warm bread. Her hands were soft. She embroidered hunting scenes onto tapestries, while Rowan tracked wounded elk through 3-day snowstorms. She was 22 and looked younger, and had never, as far as Rowan knew, wanted any of what was about to be placed on her shoulders. Calder lifted the binding cloak and settled it across Iselin's trembling frame. Iselin made a sound, small, involuntary, not joy and not grief, but the exhalation of something that has been caught and knows it. I claim you, Iselin of the Riverlands. Calder's voice occupied the vaulted ceiling completely, the way it occupied every space it entered, to bind my house, to bear my heirs, to be the light of my reign. 300 wolves howled. The sound was physical. It came through the floor and up through the soles of Rowan's boots and rattled the iron brackets on the walls, and it was so sudden and so total that for a moment the incense smell was simply gone, replaced by the raw collective biology of a pack in celebration. Lords raised fists. Old Harwick, who had survived 6 kings and smelled permanently of pipe smoke and preserved authority, made a sound that was half howl and half the bark of a very old dog who has remembered what it was. Rarian looked at Calder one final time. He was looking down at Iselin. His hand rested on her thin shoulder, with the careful restraint of a man holding something fragile, and knowing it. His face was the face she had seen, when he signed documents he disagreed with, when he made promises to men he did not respect, because the alternative cost more than the promise. Not happiness, not cruelty. The expression of a man who has completed a calculation and accepted the result. He had chosen the answer the council had been asking for. He had chosen the unambiguous bloodline and the clean alliance and the soft queen, who would not require him to explain anything that was difficult to explain. He had looked at Rowan and everything she was carrying, some of which he suspected, and none of which he had waited long enough to confirm. And he had turned and walked toward the simpler option. Iselin looked up. Just once. Just before Rowan's back disappeared into the crowd, their eyes met across the noise, and the smoke, and the celebrating pack. What lived in Iselin's expression was not triumph. It was not satisfaction. It was the specific guilt of someone who had known something was coming and had not found a way to stop it, and would carry the knowledge of that failure in a particular way for a long time. Rowan turned away and pushed into the crowd and did not look back. The lower corridors below the great hall were empty. Every servant had been pressed upstairs to manage the feast logistics, hauling trenchers and rolling barrels through the back passages, while the lords celebrated above. Down here only the torches remained, guttering in drafts that came through the old stone at irregular intervals, throwing the tunnel walls into moving patterns of light and shadow. Rowan moved through them without hurrying, not running. Running left a signature that any competent guard could read, the specific sweat of panic departure, sharp and metallic, distinct from the smell of exertion. She walked the way she walked on patrol, with the deliberate economy of someone who knew where they were going, and had already settled the question of whether to go. Her chamber was small and windowless, and smelled of saddle leather and beeswax polish. She closed the heavy oak door, stood with her back against it for exactly as long as the shaking required. It started in her knees and moved upward, and she bit down on the heel of her palm and let it pass through her without performing what it wanted her to perform. One sounds gaped, abbreviated, involuntary, before she closed the passage on it. Then she moved. The wooden chest at the foot of her bed held what she needed at the bottom. She bypassed the silk ribbons Iselin had given her last name day, bypassed the embroidered underdresses and the mirror of polished silver from the southern traders, went directly to the layers underneath. Thick wool tunics, leather breeches with double-stitched knees, a waxed canvas cloak heavy with old campfire smoke, and still carrying the faint mineral smell of a dozen different kinds of rain. She packed the way she had packed for the Thornfield campaign at 24. Minimum weight, maximum function, nothing that wasn't going to earn its place on her back. A canvas rucksack, the wool, the leather, the cloak from the armory trunk, her own, keyed to a lock she had commissioned privately from a smith in the lower city. She took the short sword. Its blade was a hand's width shorter than regulation, designed for close work in dense terrain, and the grip had been worn to the exact shape of her hand over years of daily use. She slid it home in its scabbard, 3 daggers, a whetstone wrapped in dry cloth, flint and steel in a waterproofed pouch. Then she saw the knife. It was resting on dark velvet at the back of the trunk. The handle had been carved from winter stag bone by a craftsman in the far north, a man who took 6 months for a commission and charged accordingly, and produced things that lasted. The blade was folded steel, dark and patient, the kind of edge that held in cold weather when lesser steel went brittle. Calder had pressed it into her hands in the northern pass, the winter before last, after the ambush that had come out of the tree line at dawn, while they were 3 days from the nearest garrison. He had been bleeding from his left hand where a blade had found the gap in his gauntlet, and he had pressed the knife into hers with a specific quality of deliberateness that she had at the time interpreted as meaning something. To guard my back, he'd said. Low. Close. His breath warm against her temple in the freezing air. She stood looking at the knife for a long moment. Some part of her, the part that had spent 3 years building and understanding she now understood, had been unilateral, wanted to leave it. Wanted the visual of it sitting on its velvet square, small and deliberate and abandoned, for him to find when he eventually came looking. Wanted the sting of that. She picked it up and strapped it to her thigh. Pride did not skin rabbits. Pride did not start fires in wet wood. She was going to be in the high borderlands before winter deepened, and she was going to need every ladle she had brought and possibly more. She went to the wash basin, took the hard lye soap, the kind used for chainmail maintenance, the kind that took skin to red and left it smelling like nothing, and stripped the linen dress off, and began to wash with the focused thoroughness of someone performing a practical task. She was a wolf. Her scent was her signature, and her scent was changing in ways she could not fully control, rounding into something sweeter and heavier with the biology of what she was carrying. She scrubbed until the water ran cold and her skin was tight and raw. Then she opened the small leather pouch from under the loose floorboard, maintained there for 2 years out of the same professional habit that made her know every exit in every building she spent time in, and worked a careful pinch of wolfsbane powder into the collar of the canvas cloak. Her eyes watered immediately. She breathed through her mouth. She shouldered the pack, felt its weight settle. Good weight, real weight, the weight of a decision made and committed to. The servants' gate was unlocked until midnight for kitchen deliveries. Rowan had catalogued this detail in her first month at Valden Moor, the same way she had catalogued every access point. Not because she had anticipated needing to use it under these specific circumstances, but because useful information had no expiration date, and the cost of noting it was 0. She stepped through at the quarter hour before midnight. The storm was not gradual. It arrived fully committed, a wall of cold rain, driven sideways by a wind that had been building somewhere over the northern peaks for days, and had chosen this particular hour to deliver its conclusions. The cobblestones outside the gate became one sheet of black water in seconds. 2 of the exterior wall torches extinguished simultaneously. The darkness that replaced their light was immediate and complete, and Rowan walked into it without slowing. She did not look back at the towers of Valden Moor. They were visible for approximately 30 seconds, shapes against the lightning-split sky, massive and lit and full of the sounds of celebration that the wind was carrying out over the walls and away into the dark. Then, the rain intensified, and soon the shapes dissolved into weather, and there was nothing behind her worth turning to see. She stepped off the King's Road at 40 feet and pushed into the tree line. Mud immediately, ankle-deep in the soft ground beneath the first row of pines. She moved north, parallel to the road but not on it. The road left prints even in rain if the mud was deep enough, and she was not willing to trust the storm to erase everything before morning. The mud was slower. The mud was cold. Her boots were waterlogged within the first mile, the wet leather compressing against her feet with each step in a way that would become problematic if she let it stay wet for too long. She noted it, filed it under things to address at the first shelter opportunity, kept moving. The rain was not the enemy tonight. The rain was the only ally she had, and she walked in it with a gratitude she did not examine too closely, because the situation that had made it necessary was still too close to think about. Without losing ground she could not afford to lose. 3 weeks dissolved into each other like snow into running water. Not days. She stopped counting days at the end of the first week, because the count implied a destination, and she did not have one yet, only a direction and a velocity, and a cold, clear intention that had replaced everything less functional. Time became instead the frequency of hunger, the intervals between shelter opportunities, the rate at which the terrain was changing as she pushed deeper into the unmarked northern territory that the King's maps labeled with careful script and declining specificity. She moved parallel to the road and then away from it entirely, once the forest coverage became consistent enough to offer reliable concealment. The trees grew different, out, not the managed timber stands of the settled territory but old growth that had been left alone long enough to develop its own internal logic, the big trees spacing themselves with the proprietary confidence of things that had been there before human road building and expected to be there after. She set snares at dusk and checked them at dawn, usually empty. Twice in the first week she had rabbit, Once a grouse that walked into a loop she'd set while operating on 3 hours of sleep, which she took as evidence that the grouse's judgment was worse than hers on a bad day. She ate without ceremony, crouched over small fires built in depressions that would contain the light. The smoke diffused by the canopy above before it could carry a visible column. She was cold. Not dangerously, but persistently. The cold that becomes a traveling companion when there is no warm room waiting at the end of the day's walking. She had been this cold before, on winter campaigns when supply lines failed, and the garrison was 2 days out. And there was nothing to do but keep the body moving, and let the movement generate what warmth it could. She knew the cold's specific language by now. She knew where it would try to establish footholds and how to deny it. She talked to the two lives that were not yet lives, because there was no one else, and she had never been good at sustained silence when something was pressing on her. Not in daylight. Daylight required full external attention. But at night, in the hollow beneath a fallen oak, or the back of a shallow cave, or the cramped space between two boulders with the canvas cloak pulled round everything, she would rest one hand against her stomach and say things into the dark, plans, observations. Sometimes apologies for the accommodations. Once, on the 18th night, something answered. She was in the root hollow of an overturned oak, a natural space the size of a large wardrobe, smelling of soil and fungal decay and the paper-dry shells of dead beetles. She had been still for an hour, letting the cold work out of her muscles, and she was not fully awake and not fully asleep when she felt it. Not hunger, not muscle, not the ordinary internal complaints of a body under sustained stress, Cisa. Something with intention behind it. A small, deliberate movement. The unmistakable communication of occupied space asserting its reality. She went absolutely still, and then it happened again, right against her palm, which had gone there without her telling it to. Stronger, unambiguous. Two separate presences, not one, asserting themselves in sequence, with the faint but definite distinction of separate entities occupying the same space. Ranyan exhaled, pressed her hand flatter, and in the dark of the root hollow, with the rain on the wood above her, and no witnesses and nothing to perform for, she made a sound she could not have described, not a laugh, not a cry. Something that existed between them and belonged to neither category. The sound of a body finally receiving confirmation of something it had been carrying as hypothesis. She pressed the back of her other hand against her mouth, let it pass through her completely, then wiped her out her face on her sleeve and pulled the cloak tighter, and did not sleep for another 2 hours, lying in the dark with her hand where it was, waiting to see if it happened again. It did. She found the hut on the 41st day, in the leading edge of a blizzard that had misread. The sky had been threatening since morning. The specific bruised purple that meant serious accumulation rather than a passing system. And she had been watching it and recalculating her position relative to potential shelter for 6 hours before the temperature drop made the recalculation academic. The snowflakes arrived in the coin-sized variety that meant the storm had committed. She was 2 miles from anything she'd previously identified as a shelter option, moving into unfamiliar terrain, and the light was failing. She was navigating on instinct. Her wolf when handling the directional work, while her human body concentrated on the mechanics of forward motion. The snowshoes she'd built from bent willow and dried hide were holding, mostly. One lashing had frayed. Her feet were wet. Through a stand of stunted birch she saw a shape too angular to be natural. She drew the bone-handled knife. The crofter's hut was old, field stone walls and a turf roof that had partially collapsed on the left side, the door listing inward on a single rusted hinge. She approached from downwind and stood outside it for a full minute, reading the air. No smoke, no human or wolf scent. Rodents, old ash, wet decay. Someone who had lived here once and left long enough ago that all their personal markers had dissolved. She went inside. The floor was packed earth, scattered with dead leaves and animal evidence. In the center, a crude circular hearth built from fieldstone, wide, practical, cold. The right half of the roof was intact. The door could be wedged shut. She dropped the pack against the standing wall and sat down on the floor, with her back against the stone, and breathed. Just breathed. Her legs had been making requests for the past 4 hours that she had been declining, and the act of sitting was so immediately physical a relief that she held still inside it for a long moment before moving again. She built a fire. The process was methodical, because methodical was the available mode. She scraped ash from the hearth, pulled lint from the inner lining of her tunic, accumulated deliberately in a sewn pocket for exactly this use, and arranged it with dry kindling from a rotted ceiling beam she pulled down. Flint, steel, first strike, second. The third sent a spark into the lint, and she cupped it immediately, breathing on it with the focused restraint of someone who had started fires in worse conditions than this, and understood precisely how much failure cost. The flame held. She built it up gradually, lint to kindling, to split wood to the larger sections of the rotted beam, until she had something self-sustaining, and the heat it began to throw was small but real, and she moved close to it and let it work. She stripped off the wet outer layer, hung the canvas cloak from a protruding stone, sat in the firelight and felt warmth arriving in stages the way it always did, fingers first, then the persistent knot between her shoulder blades, then deeper, the bone cold that settles in when the body has been operating below temperature long enough to stop protesting. 2 kicks, in close sequence, the first assertive, the second like punctuation. Feisty, she said. The word sat in the firelit air of the stone room. She had not meant to say it, but the accuracy of it was undeniable, and the small warmth it produced in her chest was different from the fire's warmth. And she allowed herself that much without examining it further. Further, she looked at the flames and thought about the hall she had left, the fire in the great hearth, the certainty of breakfast appearing every morning, regardless of the previous night's hunting. 3 years of that. 3 years of the warm room and the reliable meals and the proximity to someone whose presence had reorganized her sense of what was possible. Let him have it. All of it. The warm hall and the silver cloak and the political convenience of a queen who would ask nothing difficult. She looked down at the swell beneath the wool she hadn't removed. He wanted heirs. She said to the fire, her voice steadier than she expected, roughened by weeks of limited use. He is going to get them. He will simply never know it. Outside, the blizzard had found its full register, a sustained, pressured roar against the fieldstone that came through the soles of her boots' vibration. Inside, the fire crackled, and the shadows moved, and the warmth was real enough, now that she could stop monitoring it and let it simply be. She ate the last strip of dried meat, made it last. Thought about the creek she had crossed 2 miles south, good fishing come the melt, if she could rig a frame. Thought about the spring, which was still months away, and which she would reach, or not reach based on decisions made correctly in the interim. She pulled the drying cloak around her shoulders and closed her eyes. The storm continued to do what storms do, filling in tracks, covering evidence, returning the road outside to its original anonymity. What had felt like punishment at the tree line had become, by midnight, something that served her purposes exactly. She slept. In the capital's private council chamber, a man sat alone at a table that held a locked drawer and a dying fire. He had dismissed the council 2 hours earlier. The celebration above was still audible, muffled through several floors of stone, reduced to a rhythmic vibration that told him the pack had moved from howling into sustained feasting. This was normal. This was what he had produced tonight. This was the outcome he had calculated and chosen and executed. He was looking at the table, specifically at the surface of it, at the grain of the oak, at the small imperfection in the finish near the left corner that he had been noticing for 3 years and had never done anything about. His trackers had reported her absence the following morning. He had told himself she had stepped out, that she needed air, that she had gone somewhere to process what had happened, that she would be back before the end of the feast if he was patient. By the second morning, the patience was becoming something else, something with an edge to it that he did not examine directly. By the fourth day, the searching was no longer private. By the sixth, the river teams brought the report he had been waiting for and had not wanted to receive. 2 miles downstream, caught in the roots of a waterlogged willow, the canvas cloak, torn along the shoulder seam, heavy with river water. He had held it himself. Had stood by the river in the early morning cold, while the rest was asleep, and held the piece of cloth in both hands, and felt something happen in his chest that he did not have a word for, and was not going to look for one because doing so required acknowledgments he was not equipped to make in the current configuration of his life. He placed it in the drawer, turned the key, put the key in his breast pocket. He would tell the council that the search had been conducted as a matter of protocol and had produced the most probable conclusion. He would tell the council nothing else. A knock at the door. Iselin entered alone. She had removed the binding cloak. It was being stored in the ceremonial vault, as protocol required, and was wearing a plain wool robe. Her dark hair loose around her face, the elaborate styling of the evening dissolved into something simpler. She looked like someone who had been awake for a long time and had come to the end of whatever had been keeping her going. She stood across the table from him in the near dark, looked at his face, looked at the table, at the drawer with its iron lock. She was carrying something, wasn't she? Not inflected as a question, delivered as a statement of something already confirmed by her own accounting, set down between them like an object. He said nothing. Iselin closed her eyes. 3 full breaths. When she opened them, the expression had changed. Not accusation, not grief, but something that had been arrived at over time and from a distance. Something settled. I thought so, she said. She walked to the door, stopped with her hand on the iron handle. I won't speak of it again. Neither of us will. A pause. That's what I can give her. It's not enough, but it's what I have. She left. He sat alone in the room with the locked drawer and the fire going hearth and the quality of silence that exists when an important thing has been said, and both parties have agreed it will not be said again. Outside, beyond the walls, in the high borderlands north of the King's Road, a storm was still doing its work. But here's what no one in that kingdom ever knew. Rowan hadn't just taken herself away. She had taken the entire future of the bloodline with her, into the dark, into the wild, and what the kingdom would eventually send soldiers to find, 18 years later, would bear no resemblance to what anyone remembered leaving behind. She survived the birth, alone. In the stone hut in early spring, when the melt had turned the forest floor into a sucking swamp, and the roof was dripping in 3 places, and there was no one on the other side of the door. That was the first miracle. The second was that she was on her feet 3 days later, because the alternative was not on the table. She did not name them immediately. Names were for things that had survived long enough to need them, and the first weeks required all available attention for the survival problem rather than the nomenclature problem. She fed them and kept them warm and kept herself fed and warm, which was a logistical challenge of sufficient complexity that it crowded out everything else, including grief and rage and the other thing that were waiting their turn. By the end of the first month, she named them. Daxton, for the boy with the amber eyes that had been open and focused since the first hour, watching her with the disconcerting attention of something that had arrived with opinions already formed. Lyris, for the girl who slept with the focused intensity of someone who had decided that sleep was serious, work deserving serious commitment, and who woke with the same quality of total alertness her brother maintained continuously. The amber eyes were the detail she had not been prepared for. Wolf pups were born blind. Human infants had eyes that were dark and unfocused for weeks. These two had neither. Daxton's eyes had opened within the first hour and found her face with a precision that should not have been possible, and had not looked away since. The color was unambiguous, the specific luminous amber of Calder's gaze, rendered at reduced scale in a face that was otherwise entirely hers, watching her from a carrying wrap. made of rabbit skin, in a collapsing stone hut in the high borderlands. She understood what it meant. She understood it immediately and completely, and sat with the understanding for a long time in the firelight, before putting it away in the category of information that was truths, and important, and not currently actionable. They were not just the king's children, they were the dominant line. Concentrated. The specific genetic expression that the council had been trying to produce through Iceland for years, apparently deciding on its own schedule and location without consulting anyone's political timeline. No one could know. She moved on from the stone hut when Daxton and Lyris were 6 weeks old. The roof had failed entirely by then, and the spring flooding was making the floor unreliable. She moved north, deeper into the unmarked territory, carrying both of them in a double wrap she had constructed from canvas and leather, strapping over the preceding 2 weeks. She had planned the carrier before the birth. She had planned a great many things before the birth, operating on the principle that preparation performed in advance was always cheaper than improvisation performed under pressure. The first year remade her in ways she had not fully anticipated. She had been a trained fighter going into the borderlands, technically proficient, experienced in field conditions, capable of extended physical hardship. What she had not been was a subsistence hunter in terrain that did not care whether she survived. The gap between those two skill sets was significant, and she had spent the better part of the first year closing it, which was expensive in time, error, and the specific education that comes from making a mistake with real consequences and noting it precisely enough that it did not happen again. She stopped fighting like someone who had been trained to fight. That was the first adjustment. Formal combat technique had been designed for engagement, for closing with an opponent and resolving the situation efficiently. Subsistence hunting in high country terrain operated at a different frequency entirely. It required patience, which was not her natural mode, and the specific quality of attention that could hold still for an hour, waiting for a situation to resolve, rather than moving to force the resolution. She had to learn both. By the second winter, she was setting snares that caught more than they missed. By the third, she had developed a reading of animal behavior in this specific terrain, the patterns, peculiar to this altitude and tree cover and water source, that was more granular and more reliable than anything in the field had years ago. In a different life. She stopped counting days in the second year. Not from despair, from the practical observation that the count had stopped providing useful information. Seasons replaced the calendar. The arrival of specific birds marked time more reliably than any numbered day. The angle of morning light through the stunted birches told her where she was in the year with an hour accuracy that the old system had never matched. In the third year, something shifted. She had been moving through the high country for long enough that the terrain had stopped treating her as a foreign object. Not accepted. The high country did not accept things. It simply ceased to actively oppose them once they had demonstrated sufficient persistence. She had demonstrated sufficient persistence. She moved through it now with the fluid economy of someone operating within a system they understood, rather than fighting a system that opposed them. One evening in the early dark of the third winter, crossing between two frozen streams in a clearing where the snow held the last of the light, she came across a wolf, not a rogue, not injured. A large gray male, fully healthy, standing at the far edge of the clearing, with the specific quality of stillness that meant he had been watching her for some time before she noticed him. She stopped. 12 felt between them. The temperature was dropping fast, the kind of cold that clarified everything. Sound, smell, the edges of objects. She did not reach for the knife. She held her ground and let the silence settle, and let her scent carry. Not the wolfsbane, not the masking, just herself, which by the third year was no longer the scent of a court scout from the Southern Territory. It was the scent of someone who had been living in this specific forest for 3 years and had absorbed its particular combination of cold water and pine resin and granite dust and wood smoke. The wolf took 2 steps toward her, stopped, then lowered his head. Not the full submission of a subordinate before an alpha, not throat-exposed capitulation, but something lateral. An acknowledgement of category. The look of an animal that had completed its classification and arrived at a conclusion that its instincts had not initially suggested. It turned and walked back into the trees. She stood in the clearing for a long time after it left. Her hand was on the bone-handled knife she had not drawn. She was not, she told herself with the precision she applied to all important distinctions, part of the forest. That was the romantic idea, the one that appeared in the stories people told about the wild from the safety of warm rooms. She was a wolf who happened to be walking upright in a forest that had slowly, reluctantly, stopped treating her presence as an anomaly requiring response. The distinction mattered. She was not something the wild had absorbed. She was something the wild had been forced to accommodate. The difference between those two things was the difference between being lost and being somewhere intentionally. And she was always somewhere intentionally. Daxton and Lyris were 3 years old that winter. They were not developing on Najot's schedule that human children developed on, or on the schedule that wolf pups developed on. They were developing on their own schedule, which appeared to be faster than both, and governed by internal imperatives that she was learning to read, rather than trying to manage. Daxton had been walking since 14 months. Not the tentative balance testing of a child learning the skill, but the immediate, committed walking of something that had decided bipedal locomotion was the current best option and had implemented it without the usual apprenticeship period. Lyris had followed 3 weeks later, within another month, and within another month, they were both moving through the terrain around their camp with a confident ground-covering stride that Rowan occasionally caught herself studying for technique. They communicated in a private language that combined vocalizations, gesture, and a specific subtle shifts of and scent that constituted the deeper grammar of wolf communication. They understood her speech. They responded to it. They did not produce it themselves yet, not from inability. She was increasingly certain, but from the same pragmatic efficiency that governed everything else they did. Words were loud. Words were imprecise compared to what they were already doing. They would add words to the repertoire when words became useful. She taught them what she knew in the way things were taught out here. By demonstration, by consequence, by the instrumentalized feedback loop of an environment that responded to mistakes with objective results rather than emotional ones. She showed them how to read wind direction and what it told you about what was upwind. She showed them how to build a fire that would last, and how to build one that would not produce visible smoke. She showed them how to move through dry underbrush without producing sound, which required a specific quality of weight distribution that took months to make automatic. She did not tell them about Valdenmoor. They were too young for the intrusion to be anything but weight they couldn't carry yet. There would be time. She had told herself there would be time, and she had been telling herself this for 3 years, and she would tell herself this for 15 more, because the right moment had a reliable tendency to present itself as later. The merchant arrived in the 6th year on an exhausted mule, pulling a cart whose left rear wheel was developing a split that would fail catastrophically within another 3 miles of use. Rowan watched him from the tree line for 2 full days. Anything new in the territory got watched before it got approached. This was not paranoia. It was the application of consistent methodology to a situation where the cost of a wrong assessment was high. He was old, 60s. The specific softness of a man who had spent his life behind a counter rather than moving through difficult terrain. He had the watchful, patient manner of someone who had survived a long time in a trade that rewarded observation and punished carelessness. He was also thoroughly lost. Sitting on a rock on the morning of the 3rd day, eating from a cloth parcel with the resigned expression of a man who has accepted that the day is not going to resolve the way he'd planned it. She approached from his downwind side and let him hear her footsteps at 15 feet, which was near enough to be committed and far enough that he had time to process the encounter before she was on top of him. He startled badly. This was fair. She looked, by this point in her 6th year in the high borderlands, like someone who had been living in the high borderlands for 6 years. She offered him dried meat. He accepted it with the speed of a man whose hunger had overridden his caution. She told him she wanted information in exchange. He understood the transaction and began to talk, and she sorted what he said as it arrived, discarding rumor, retaining first-hand observation. The same triage she had applied to intelligence reports for 18 years of field work. Doran, the boy born to Iselin and Calder in the 2nd year of the marriage, was 5 years old and had not yet spoken. The healers described his bones as having an unusual fragility. Small fractures from ordinary activity, the kind of impact that produced bruises in other children, producing injuries in him, that required splinting and weeks of enforced immobility. 3 specialists had been through the capital in the past year. None had produced a satisfying diagnosis or a working treatment. The council was not speaking about this publicly, the merchant said, and then paused in the way of a man who had said the first half of a thing and was deciding how to say the second. The council was speaking about it privately, in the kind of private conversations that tended, historically, to precede changes in political arrangements. Raryan listened to all of this without expression. The merchant watched her face for the reactions that gossip of this quality usually produced, and found nothing to read and eventually stopped watching. She thanked him, told him about the wheel, showed him the wedge fix, a specific piece of split firewood shimmed under the axle, with a strip of leather binding that would buy him another 10 miles if he kept the load light. He looked at her with the expression of a man who had expected many possible things from this conversation in the high borderlands, and had not expected competent wagon repair advice, and she turned and walked back into the trees. She sat with the news alone that evening, the way she sat with everything that required actual processing. She had imagined, in the abstract, that news of Calder's heir failing would produce something in her. Some version of the dark satisfaction that arrived when a bad decision produced its predicted consequences. She waited for it, checked for it carefully, the way she checked a wound, probing the perimeter to see what was there. Cold, that was what was there. Not the cold of suppressed feeling, but the cold of genuine absence. She had been walking away from the altar for 6 years, and had apparently walked far enough that the landmarks were no longer visible from her current position. She was not glad Doran was sick. She was not glad about any of it. What she felt instead, examining it with the same precision she applied to everything that mattered, a clear, flat relief. She was outside the blast radius. Whatever happened in Valdenmoor now, the succession crisis, the political maneuvering, the desperate search for a solution to a problem that had been created, on a specific night in a specific hall, none of it could reach her here. She had removed herself from the equation. She pulled her cloak around her and let the fire die to coals, and went to sleep under a sky that had no opinion about succession crises, and no memory of stone halls, and no record of any of it except the cold, clear fact of the stars moving overhead on their own unchanging schedule. The wolf with the damaged rear leg found her in the 7th year, a female, young, 2, maybe 3 years old. The injury was old enough to have partially healed incorrectly, leaving her with a functional gait at walking speed and a significant liability at anything faster. Her pack had moved on, which was not cruelty. It was the arithmetic of pack survival in terrain that did not subsidize permanent accommodation of the non-functional. She had been working the edge of the territory Rowan had come to think of as hers, not claimed in any formal sense, but defended consistently through years of use, which was the only kind of claim that meant anything out here. She was staying just inside the margin. Not approaching, not leaving. The patient positioning of something that had run out of other options. On the 4th day, Rowan left a piece of dried venison at the boundary point. not sentiment. She had learned to distinguish between sentiment and strategy with considerable precision over 6 years of situations where the difference mattered. A wolf that owed its continued existence to her presence had structural reasons to stay. A wolf that stayed and proved functional added to the perimeter awareness she maintained around the territory, the early warning system that no human-built sensor could replicate in this terrain. The transaction was clear, and its terms were practical, and the wolf, whose intelligence Rowan had assessed correctly, appeared to understand them. 2 more wolves arrived over the following months. Then 3, each one assessed, each one given terms that were implicit but consistent. This territory operates on specific principles. The principles are not negotiable, and staying foe requires accepting them. None of them were weak. The weak did not survive long enough in the high borderlands to reach her territory. What arrived were animals that were, in their various ways, too strong or too independent, or too idiosyncratic for the pack structures below. Animals that needed a framework that could accommodate what they actually were, rather than requiring them to compress into a shape determined by someone else's hierarchy. By the 10th year, there were 7. This was not a plan. It was an outcome. She had been building something without the intent to build something, and what she had built had its own logic that she could recognize in retrospect, even if she had not designed it in advance. In the 11th year, a second merchant, younger, less experienced, visibly anxious, and therefore significantly more forthcoming than his professional interests should have permitted, arrived in the eastern borderlands, her trendy having taken the wrong turn at a fork 6 miles south, and traveled in the wrong direction long enough for the terrain to make unambiguous what his maps had failed to communicate. The information he carried was not gossip. It was the kind of specific, sourced intelligence that came from someone with genuine access to the capital's operational planning. Calder had commissioned a formal expansion of the Northern Search Territory. Not the unfocused casting of teams into blank space that had characterized the previous years, but a directed operation. Specific quadrant, specific methodology, specific objective, because the previous teams had found something, not her, but evidence of her. The tracking reports that had come back over the previous 2 seasons described a pattern of territory use that did not match any known rogue behavior. Sustained habitation over multiple years, modified game trails, scent markers with coherent territorial logic, and footprints, bipedal, consistent across multiple seasons, at the center of a pattern that organized itself around a specific moving point. Calder knew the shape of what he was looking for. He did not yet know what it had become. Rowan dismissed the young merchant with wide directions to the eastern road and a clear instruction about the consequences of discussing what he had seen in the high country. Then she stood in the trees above her camp for a long time and let the full weight of the situation configure for itself in her mind. The passive approach was finished. 11 years of it had worked because the search had been unfocused. Teams covering too much ground with too little direction to find someone who had made herself unfindable, but a pack left evidence that a single person did not. She had known this and had managed it, and she had managed it well enough that it had taken 11 years for the evidence to accumulate to the threshold of actionable intelligence. The management window was closing. She needed higher ground and time to learn it, and she needed to do something. She had been postponing for 15 years with increasingly thin justifications. She needed to have the conversation with Daxton and Lyris. They were 15. They moved through the territory with a competence that exceeded hers in specific domains. Daxton's spatial memory for terrain was effectively perfect, and Lyris had developed a capacity for reading behavioral patterns in both animals and weather system that Rowan had learned to trust completely. They had been operating as functional partners in the management of the territory for 3 years. They deserved to know what the territory was for and what was coming toward it. She was not ready. She had been not ready for 15 years, which was its own kind of data. She gave them another 3 years. She told herself it was because they needed to be fully grown for the information to be carried correctly. This was partly true. It was also partly the specific reluctance of someone who has carried a thing alone for so long, that the act of sharing it requires putting it down. And putting it down requires acknowledging that it has been carried, and acknowledging that it has been carried requires feeling the weight of it fully for the first time in years. In the 18th year, when Dax and Irnlers were old enough that the postponement had become something she would have to explain rather than simply perpetuate, she saw the first fire on the southern horizon. Not a campfire, not a lightning strike, a controlled burn, moving with the systematic, deliberate pace of an organized operation. The smoke column was wrong for natural fire. Too straight, too consistent, the product of fuel being added at regular intervals, rather than the variable consumption of a wildfire, working through available material. Calder was burning the forest out. She watched the smoke for 3 days before she sent the signal. A specific seek that carried farther than a human voice in and was indistinguishable to untrained ears from the natural communication of the local wolf population. The signal that meant, "Come back, now. All of you." And then she sat by the fire in the high camp and began, for the first time in 18 years, to put down what she had been carrying. Daxton arrived first, with Lyris 3 steps behind his right shoulder, and they settled across the fire from her with the complete, patient attention. That was their most consistent characteristic, and she looked at them. 18 years old, amber-eyed, built by this terrain into things the court below had no category for, and she began at the beginning. She told them about Volden Moor, about the hall and the ceremony and the stone pillar, and what she had been carrying, and what she had seen, and what she had understood in the moment of seeing it. She told them about the locked drawer, and Isolin's silence and walking into the storm. She told it without bitterness, which was not performance. The bitterness had been epithelialized over 18 years into something that had no emotional valence left, only information content. Daxton listened without interrupting. Lyris listened with the specific quality of attention she brought to things she intended to act on. When Rowan finished, the fire had burned down by half. The smoke from the south was still visible above the tree line, closer than it had been that morning. Daxton looked at it. He's not going to stop at the perimeter. No, then we run. Not a question. No. Lyris turned from the smoke to her mother. You've already chosen the ground. I know a ridge, Rowan said. 3 days' travel. I need you to learn it. They left the following morning. The ridge took a full day to reach on foot, moving at the pace the terrain demanded rather than the pace urgency had suggested. Rowan had learned, over 18 years, that urgency was the enemy of good decisions in difficult ground. It compressed the assessment window and produced the kind of shortcuts that became problems later, usually at the worst possible time. She moved at the pace that kept all 3 of them functional and observant, and they arrived at the ridge in late afternoon of the first day, with enough light left to begin learning it. It was a natural defensive position of the kind that terrain occasionally produced without human intention. Along spines of exposed granite, running east to west along the upper face of a steep slope, accessible from the south via a narrow shale approach that funneled anything coming up into a predictable line of travel and dropping away on the north side into a dense pine forest that covered the slope down to the valley floor. The eastern end of the ridge terminated in a sheer granite face. The western end broke into a series of lower rock formations that offered concealment without exit. There was one way up from the south. There was one way off to the north. A crack in the granite at the western end, wide enough for a person moving sideways, running at a descending angle through the rock face before opening onto the pine-covered slope below. Rowan had found it 7 years ago while ranging the upper territory, had widened it by careful increments over several winters, and had told no one about it, because useful information about exit routes was information you kept until you needed it. She showed it to them on the first evening. "This is the only way off the ridge that they won't be able to follow immediately," she said, standing at the entrance to the crack. The wind was coming from the north, cold and clean, carrying the pine smell of the slope below. "It needs to be widened here." She indicated a point 2 feet in where the crack narrowed by about 4 inches on the left side. "The rock is shale at that point. It will move." Daxton crouched and examined the narrowing, ran his hand along the fracture line. 2 hours. "Tonight," Rowan said. "While there's still time." She left him to it and took Lyris along the full length of the ridge, walking it slowly from east to west and back, talking as they moved. She described the sight lines from each position, where the shale approach was visible, where it was obscured by the angle of the rock, where a person standing on the ridge would be visible from below, and where they would not. She described the wind patterns she had observed from this elevation on the 3 previous occasions she had been here, and what those patterns did to scent dispersal and sound travel. She described the specific load-bearing characteristics of the shale on the upper approach, which was not the stable footing it appeared from below. Lyris listened and looked, and asked 3 questions, each one identifying a variable Rowan had not explicitly addressed. This was consistent with her characteristic mode of engagement. She processed what she was given, and then moved immediately to what was missing, rather than confirming what she had already received. On the second day, they moved through the ridge at every hour of available light and the early dark, not studying it from fixed positions, but inhabiting it, moving through it repeatedly until the shapes and distances were in their muscles rather than only in their visual memory. Rowan had taught them this methodology years ago. You did not know ground until your body knew it. And your body learned through repetition in variable conditions rather than through single-pass observation. On the afternoon of the second day, Lyris stopped at the upper left section of the ridge where a granite outcropping projected outward from the Fane face and held a boulder formation that had been accumulating pressure from the slope above it for what appeared to be a very long time. She stood looking at it for several minutes without speaking. If that came down, she started, it would close the approach from the south, Rowan said. Completely, for long enough. Lyris looked at the formation, at the angle of the slope above it, at the specific point where the primary boulder was resting against the secondary stones beneath it. It wouldn't come down on its own, no, it would need help. A lever, placed correctly, applied at the right moment. How much help? Less than you'd think. The balance has been working toward this for years. The right force at the right point and gravity does the rest. Rowan looked at her daughter. It needs to be set up in advance. The lever placed and tested, but not triggered. So that when the moment comes, the trigger is a small action, rather than a large one. Lyris spent the rest of the afternoon on it. She worked with patient, systematic attention she brought to anything she had decided was worth doing correctly, testing angles and leverage points, and the specific placement that would translate minimum input force into maximum output result. She did not ask for help. She reported her conclusions that evening: the placement, the trigger mechanism, the estimated time between trigger and full collapse of the approach, with the precision of someone who had done the engineering and was confident in the numbers. On the morning of the third day, the fire reached the lower valley. The smoke had been building since the previous evening, a gradual thickening of the southern horizon that Rowan had been monitoring through the night, measuring its rate of advance against the ridge's distance and calculating the convergence timeline. By dawn, the orange-black of burning pine resin was visible above the tree line. The temperature on the ridge was already 10 degrees warmer than it had been at first light. Animals moved through the undergrowth below in the panicked, directionless urgency of things that had been presented with a threat too large for navigation. Rowan read their movement as secondary information, a living pressure gauge indicating the campfire's proximity and the direction of advance. Everything that could move was moving north. She sent the wolves, 7 animals, dispersed into the deep north along the routes she had established and tested over years for exactly this contingency. She had developed specific directional signals that the wolves had learned to read without requiring the kind of explicit command that presupposed a teacher-student dynamic she had never tried to establish. She gave them the signals. They understood what was required of them and moved without hesitation. This was the nature of what she had built. Not dependents following orders, but entities that understood the logic of the arrangement well enough to execute their part correctly when the time came, the ridge filled with smoke as the morning advanced. Not the blinding, choking quantity of a wildfire directly below, but a constant presence, gray and acrid, thickening in the updraft from the valley and thinning when the wind shifted, reducing visibility in variable intervals. Rowan positioned herself at the highest accessible point of the ridge's main spine. Daxton took the upper granite outcropping above, and to the right, the position that gave him the widest sight line on the southern approach, and that placed him, from the perspective of anyone coming up that approach, slightly above and behind the primary figure on the ridge. Lyris was in the shadows of the western rock formations, with the lever positioned, and her hand on it, and her eyes on her mother. They did not discuss the plan in detail. The detail had been built into the preparation over the previous 3 days, and the preparation was complete. And what remained was the execution of it, which was always simpler than the preparation. If the preparation had been done correctly, below, through the smoke, the sound of boots on shale began. Organized, spaced, the footfall pattern of soldiers moving in tactical formation, not running, not cautious, but the metronomic advance of people who had done this many times and had a clear objective and believed the opposition to be a single rogue woman rather than what was actually waiting for them on the ridge above. Rowan put her hand on the handle of the bone-handled knife and let the sound come. The soldiers emerged from the smoke in a line, 12 on the primary approach, more behind. She could hear the secondary formation working its way up the shale 60 feet below the first. They wore Valdenmore silver and black, heavy boiled leather with the bare crest, crossbows at the low ready, bolts seated. 2 handlers with iron-chained mastiffs that were pressing hard against the restraint, their noses working at the smoke, with the concentrated desperation of animals that had been tracking something for days, and could feel the distance finally, definitively closing. The captain at the front raised his fist. The line stopped. He read the ridge with the systematic attention of a man doing his job properly, assessing the ground, noting the sight lines, identifying the single figure standing at the highest point with a broken short sword held at her side, and a quality of absolute stillness that his professional experience probably told him was not the stillness of fear. Drop the weapon. His voice carried the flat authority of someone who had given this instruction many times. By order of the AlphaKing. Submit to irons, or be shot where you stand. Rowan did not lower the sword. She was reading the smoke. In the variable visibility it offered, she caught glimpses of the formation below. The spacing of the soldiers, the positions of the handlers, the point at which the chained mastiffs were anchored. She was also reading the smell underneath the smoke, the complex layering of armored men and oiled leather, and the specific sweat of sustained field operation. And beneath all of that, the line parted. Not at the captain's command. From the pressure of the man moving through it from the rear. The specific kind of movement that made crowds rearrange themselves without instruction, that had always made rooms just to his presence before he had fully entered them. She had not seen it in 18 years, and she recognized it in the first 2 seconds. Calder. He was not what memory had been carrying. Memory had maintained the 34-year-old version. Dark-haired, amber-eyed, physically certain, in the way of someone who had never seriously questioned their own capacity. What came through these smoke was what 18 years of sustained pressure had produced from that material. The hair was gray throughout, not silver-streaked. The beard he had not worn at the ceremony was short and well maintained, but could not conceal the lines that had been carved into the face around it. He was still large, still carried the weight of authority in the frame, but the amber eyes, she saw them find her across the smoke and the distance, and what she saw in them was not the flat exhaustion she might have expected. He had lit up. The focus that had come into his face when his eyes found hers was the focus of someone who had been looking for something for a very long time and had located it. She observed this, filed it, did not let it mean anything it was not yet entitled to mean. He stopped 12 feet from her. He looked at the scar along her jaw. Wolverine, 9th year, the result of a poor approach angle on a kill site she had arrived at too quickly. He looked at the forearms, which carried the specific musculature of 18 years of sustained physical work that the training ground had never produced. He looked at the way she was standing, weight forward, settled into the rock, the stillness of someone who has already decided and is waiting for events to arrive at the same conclusion. Rowan, one word. The way you said the name of something you had given up on finding and had just found. The king shouldn't wander this far from his hearth. Her voice had changed over 18 years, rougher, the edges worn down by limited use and cold air and smoke. It was still hers. It was steadier than she expected it to be, which told her something useful about how far she had actually traveled from the night she had left. The ash will ruin your fine furs. Something moved across his face, not a smile, but the shadow of a recognition. The specific recognition of a man, hearing a tone that he had forgotten was possible. The particular cadence of someone who had never been impressed by him and had never performed otherwise. The trackers reported you drowned. His voice was controlled, but the control was work she could see at its edges. The spring floods. We found the cloak, flat, a wolfsbane trick. To keep your trackers off the scent long enough for the rain to do the rest. The captain behind him had achieved a specific stillness. The handlers were struggling with the mastiffs, who had caught something in the air that was producing, not the prey excitement of a few minutes ago, but something more conflicted. The animal response to a scent their training had not prepared them for. Calder took one step forward, stopped when she did not move. 18 years. His voice fractured slightly at the edges of the number. Not performance. Actual fracture. I sent teams north every year for the first 6. I know. After the cloak, the council considered the matter closed. I did not consider it closed. A pause in which he appeared to be deciding how to continue and rejecting the first several options. Doran is dying. Not quickly. He has been dying slowly for 12 years, the way things die, when they lack what they needed from the beginning. The council has stopped meeting with me on succession questions because there is no succession to discuss. 3 of the Eastern Lords have realigned their political positions in anticipation of a vacancy. He held her eyes. I made the wrong choice. I knew it before the end of the first year. I have known it every year since. You chose the safe road, not cruel, diagnostic. You chose the council's approval, and the clean alliance and the queen, who would not require you to explain anything complicated. You chose glass, Calder. And now you're standing on a burning mountain because the glass is cracking, and you've come north looking for stone. Something in his face acknowledged the accuracy of this, without trying to argue with it. Iselin told me something, he said. On the morning after the ceremony, he stopped. Reorganized. She came to my chamber alone. She said she was carrying something, wasn't she? Not as a question. She said she wouldn't speak of it again. She kept that promise for 18 years. The information found its place in understanding of the past, with the quiet adjustment of a piece that had always been implied by the shape of the surrounding pieces. Iselin, in the dark of a post-ceremony night, arriving at the correct conclusion and making a choice about what to do with it. Not loyalty to Calder, not protection of her own position. Something older and less complicated than either Duran. Ran absorbed it without expression. A sound from behind her, not dramatic. Simply the sound of 2 people stepping out of shadow into the edge of visibility. Calder's eyes moved past her. Lyris had stepped forward from the western rock formations, not performing an entrance. Lopper, Mornins, simply making herself present in the way you moved into a room when the conversation had reached the point that required your presence. She stood, with the quality of absolute physical stillness that was hers alone. The specific stillness of someone who had grown up in terrain that rewarded stillness with survival and had internalized it completely. The mastiffs sat down, both of them, simultaneously, without command. The larger one produced a sustained low sound that was not aggression, not the growl of a dog identifying a threat, but something anterior to that, the sound of an animal encountering a classification it did not have and recognizing the gap. Calder looked at Lyris, at the jaw, the cheekbones, the amber eyes in her face, his amber, in a face built from entirely different experience, looking back at him with the calm, assessing regard of someone who had been told about him and had formed their own views, and was now conducting the primary source evaluation. Then Daxton stepped down from the upper outcropping. He came from the high position above, and to Calder's right, which required Calder to look up slightly to find him. Daxton was not hurrying. He moved down the granite face, with the unhurried confidence of someone descending familiar ground, and he stopped on the main spine of the ridge, and stood there and looked at Calder with the direct, unhurried attention of someone taking a measurement. He had Calder's architecture. The width of the shoulders, the way the physical authority distributed itself through the frame, it was recognizable as the same underlying structure, inhabited by someone who had been built by entirely different forces. 18 years of the high borderlands instead of 18 years of the council chamber. The same foundation, completely different walls, and the eyes. Calder's amber, in Daxton's face, carrying 18 years of the high country's unsentimentalized education. Calder's breath left him in a way that was not a word and not a sound, simply an exit of air. He looked from Daxton to Lyris and back to Rowan, and his face did something she had never seen it do in the 3 years she had known him. The complete dissolution of the manstred surface, not into grief exactly, but into the expression of a man looking at the precise physical consequence of the worst decision he had ever made, rendered in human form. Looking back at him from a burning ridge, with no particular need for him to feel better about it. He dropped to one knee. The steel plates of his armor struck the shale, with a sound like a bell struck once, and damped immediately. His head bowed briefly. Not submission, not performance, the involuntary response of a man absorbing a blow that arrived where he had left himself unguarded. "Twins," he said, barely above the wind. "By all the gods." The soldiers behind Calder had achieved a collective stillness that none of them had training for. The captain's hand was on his crossbow grip and going nowhere, because the room, the open, smoke-filled, burning sky room of the ridge, had reconfigured itself around a situation that the captain's experience did not cover, and his instincts were correctly telling him to observe before acting. "Get up." Rowan's voice was not unkind. It was the voice she used when a thing needed to be said, without emotional decoration. "Don't perform at me. You've been doing that for 18 years from a distance, and you know I can see it from here." He rose, slowly. The knee was slower than it would have been at 34. He straightened to his full height and looked at her, and the managed surface did not reassemble itself, which was the only honest thing about his current position. Daxton had not moved from where he'd stopped on the main spine. He was watching the exchange with the specific quality of attention he brought to situations that contained multiple variables, requiring simultaneous tracking, not detached, not passive, but moving fast behind a still surface. Calder turned to look at him directly, the look of a man trying to see something he had lost the right to see properly, trying to find, in a stranger's face, something that had always been there and that he had not been present for. "I want to know you." The sentence came out stripped of everything that might have made it work. He appeared to recognize this. He tried again. "I understand I have no claim. I understand what I chose. I'm not here to present terms or make demands or—" He stopped. Looked at Rowan. "I don't know how to do this." Daxton looked at him for a long moment. Then, "You gave up something you didn't know existed. That's different from giving up something you knew." A pause in which the precision of the distinction was allowed to settle. It doesn't make it better. But it's different. And the difference is where anything from here would have to start. The specificity of it. The refusal to grant full absolution and the equal refusal to deliver condemnation that exceeded the accurate charge. Rowan recognized the logic, had been modeling that mode of exactness since before language was possible, and now she heard it come back, from her son's mouth, directed at the man who had made it necessary, and she held herself completely still. Because the alternative was something she was not going to produce on this ridge in front of 40 soldiers. Lyris spoke. She had been watching Calder with the specific attention she brought to behavioral patterns that contained information not yet explicitly communicated. "You want us to come back," not inflected as a question. The statement of what was actually being discussed underneath everything that was nominally being discussed. That's what this is. The burning, the tracking, the personal appearance, instead of sending the captain. "You want us to come back and solve the problem." Calder looked at her, the amber eyes moving across her face, with the intensity of someone trying to see something they had lost the right to see on a normal timeline. "I want to know who you are," he said. "Both of you. That's true before anything else. The succession is real, and I'm not going to pretend it isn't. But it's not before this. It's not separate from this," Lyris said. Her voice was even, not angry, precise. "It's the engine of every decision you've made for 12 years. The failing heir. The cracking bloodline. We didn't grow up in the capital, Calder. We grew up in the high borderlands, without a garrison, or a council, or a warm hall, or any of the things that the word here's usually implies." That's not blame. It's the shape of what happened. And you need to understand the shape of it before you start talking about what comes next. Calder absorbed it. He let it land fully. Did not reach for the political language, did not deflect toward a more manageable formulation. He stood on the burning ridge and received what was true, and did not flinch away from the weight of it, which was, Rowan thought, the most honest thing she had seen him do in the entire duration of her acquaintance with him. They submit to no one. Rowan let the statement carry its full meaning. Not the council, not the pack hierarchy, not the crown, not the weight of a bloodline claim. You could bring every soldier in Valdenmoor up this ridge, and the only outcome would be a very significant reduction in your head count. She held his gaze steadily. "I am not a solution to your political problem. They are not a resource you located after a long search. We are what happened when you chose the wrong thing. You need to sit with that before any other conversation is possible." Calder was quiet for a long moment. The fire in the valley below threw light up through the smoke in orange pulses that moved across the ridge like breathing. "I won't let you walk away." His voice had changed registers. The political surface was gone, and what was underneath it was simpler and less managed. "I have 40 men on this ridge, and 200 more below. You cannot." Rowan put 2 fingers to her mouth. The whistle was not loud. 2 notes, the second lower than the first. The specific sequence she had developed over 2 days of preparation and trusted. It took 4 seconds. Long enough for Calder to begin speaking again. Long enough for the captain to raise the crossbow. Long enough for 3 soldiers to step forward. Then the ridge moved. The boulder formation on the upper left approach. The one Lyris had spent an afternoon on, testing the leverage point and the trigger mechanism, and the estimated time between action and result, released. The primary stone tilted forward and committed to gravity, and when it moved, it took the shale beneath it, and when the shale moved, the slope above it contributed everything it had been holding in potential for years, and the cascade that followed was not enormous, but it was precise, and it was placed exactly where it needed to be placed. The southern approach to the ridge ceased to exist as a viable route in 11 seconds. Dust filled the air. Soldiers shouted. The mastiffs gave voice to something unambiguously panicked. The captain went down in the secondary slide and recovered, and came up without his crossbow. 3 men were caught at the edge of the displacement, not buried, pushed sideways, held against the intact sections of the ridge face by the force of the material moving past them. 43 seconds of chaos. Then the dust began to settle. Calder was standing where he had been standing. He had not moved. He had taken a fragment of displaced rock across the left cheek, a thin line of blood through the ash on his face. And he was standing in the newly reconfigured landscape of the ridge, with the expression of a man working through a series of realizations in sequence, each one following, from the last, with the logical inevitability of a well-constructed argument. He turned back. The ridge where she had been standing was empty. The broken sword rain driven to point first into the hard earth at the precise center of the ground she had occupied, standing upright in the stone, planted with intention. Not an abandoned weapon, not a surrender, the placement of a marker. The punctuation at the end of a statement that had already been fully made. The crack in the granite at the western end of the ridge was wide enough now for a person moving sideways. And Rowan had widened it to that specification over several winters, specifically because a person moving sideways could still move quickly if the person had spent years learning how to translate urgency into efficiency rather than panic. She came through first, Daxton behind her, moving with the lateral economy of someone who had been briefed on the route and had added it to his spatial catalog immediately. Lyris last. She paused at the entrance, long enough to wedge 3 specific stones into the crack at the stress points she had identified. On the first day of the ridge preparation, points where the right force in the wrong direction would cause the passage to narrow significantly. Then she came through, and they descended. The pine forest below the northern face was dark and cold and alive in the way that forests were alive when fire had not reached them. The smell of resin and cold ground, and the small, continuous sounds of undisturbed habitation. They moved down the slope at a ground-covering pace, putting distance between themselves and the ridge without breaking into the kind of speed that sacrificed observation for distance. A mile down, Rowan stopped. She stood in the trees with the pine canopy above and the northern wind coming in, clean off the high peaks ahead. And she breathed. Let the smoke clear out of her lungs. Let the tension that had been sitting behind her sternum since the morning. She had first seen the fire on the southern horizon release. Through the simple and sufficient act of respiration, Daxton stopped beside her. Lyris came to rest on her other side. The 3 of them stood in the dark of the trees and the sound of the rockslide, and the soldiers and the burning valley behind them, now and growing smaller. He'll come north again, Lyris said. Stating a parameter. Yes, when? When he's cleared the approach and reorganized and had enough time to think about what just happened on that ridge. Rowan looked north through the canopy. The peaks were visible above the trees, white with early permanent snow, patient and indifferent to the specific human drama occurring at their feet. 8 weeks. Maybe 10. Daxton was quiet for a moment. Are you going to let him? She stood with the question. Not the easy version of it, not whether she was willing to have another conversation, but the full weight of it. Whether the man who had stood on the ridge and absorbed what her children had said to him had taken it fully, without reaching for the political management. Without the careful surface she had watched him maintain throughout every difficult moment of the 3 years she had known him, was someone who had changed enough that a second conversation, scenes, would be different in kind, rather than merely different in content. She was not interested in forgiveness as a formal act. It was too clean, too bilateral, required too many terms and conditions she had not agreed to negotiate. But something more practical and less ceremonial. The acknowledgement that 18 years of consequence had produced 18 years of change, and that the man on the ridge was not precisely the man at the altar, and that the difference, while it changed nothing about what had already happened, was relevant to any honest assessment of what might happen next. Maybe, she said. Lyris looked at her sidelong. The dry precision of 18 years of watching her mother be exactly as honest as the situation required, and not one fraction more. You drove a broken sword into a rock, at the exact spot where you were standing. That's not an answer to what I said. It's not someone who's finished with the conversation. Rowan was quiet for a moment. The wind moved through the pines above them, with the sound she had been falling asleep to for 18 years, the same frequency, the particular pitch of the high country at rest, as familiar as her own breathing. If he comes, she said finally, he comes on foot. Without the army, without the council's knowledge, without the infrastructure of the crown backing him up. A pause. On terms we determine. In conditions that require him to carry only what he's actually earned. She looked north. If he does that, if he does the actual work, then we see what the conversation produces. Daxton made a short, contained sound that was as close to amusement as he generally got. You're going to require the King of Valdenmoor to climb a mountain alone to have a conversation. He built a 40-soldier operation and burned a significant portion of the northern forest. To have the last one, Rowan said. He can manage the work for this one. She started walking north. Daxton fell in on her left. Lyris on her right. The peaks ahead were permanent and white, and the territory beyond them had never been mapped, and the fire behind them was still burning. But it was behind them now, which was where the past belonged. Calder stood on the empty ridge for a long time. The sword was still there. He had walked to it immediately, crossed the 15 feet between where he had been standing and where she had been standing, and looked down at it without touching it. The blade was driven into the rock at the precise vertical that required intention to achieve. Not dropped, not thrown, placed. With the specific deliberateness of someone who had decided what they wanted to say, and had found the correct language for it. He stood over it and understood what it said, and felt the understanding land in him the way the important things always landed. Not with noise, not with obvious drama, but with the quiet irreversibility of something permanently rearranging itself in the place where the important things were stored. The captain was organizing the recovery operation behind him, assessing injuries. 3 men with bruising, and 1 with a possible broken finger from the rockslide displacement. Conducting the head count. Beginning the engineering assessment of whether the approach could be cleared, and in what time frame. Doing his job. Rowan had calculated the rockslide with sufficient precision that no one had been seriously hurt, which Calder noted and filed alongside everything else he was filing. He reached down and took the sword. He did not assign it to a soldier. He wrapped it himself, in the cloth from his pack, that he had brought for the field dispatches. He had not ended up writing. He placed it in the transport case himself. He carried it back, down the cleared portion of the approach himself, and when the descent became impossible at the slide, and they had to go around, he kept it with him, and he brought it back through the gates of Valdenmoor himself, and carried it up to his private chambers, and set it on the table. The locked drawer was still there. He looked at the 2 objects, the wrapped transport case and the locked drawer, for a long time in the specific dark of a room that had been holding his worst thinking for 18 years. The fire in his chamber had been built up by the staff in anticipation of his return. It was warm. The warmth felt, for the first time, in a long time, like something he had not earned. He did not open the drawer. He went to find his chief scout, not his military commander, not his political advisor, not the council. The scout, the one who had been operating in difficult terrain since before Calder's reign, and who moved through the high country like water finding its level, and who could sustain field operations alone for extended periods without requiring the infrastructure that everyone else seemed to consider non-negotiable. The scout's name was Bren. She was 51 years old and had never had a title, because titles required the kind of institutional registration that people who operated the way she operated tended to avoid. She had been doing work for the Crown for 22 years on the basis of a handshake arrangement that both parties had found sufficiently reliable to maintain without formalization. Calder found her in the lower map room, which was where she spent her time between operations. Not because she had a particular affinity for maps, but because the map room was in the lower level of the keep, which was 3 floors below the soul chamber, and 3 floors was a meaningful architectural buffer between her and the kind of conversation she had no patience for. She looked up when he entered, took his condition, the dried blood on his cheek from the rock fragment, the ash on his furs, the specific quality of a man who has recently had an experience that rearranged something important and said nothing, which was one of her more useful characteristics. "I need you to find a route," he said, "to the high country above the northern boundary, passable on foot, alone, without support. And I need you to find it without telling anyone what you're doing or why." Bren looked at him for a moment. The Ridge operation came back with an interesting report. The Ridge operation came back with an incomplete picture. How incomplete? Significantly, he sat down across from her. "I need to understand the Northern Territory, not as a military objective, as a place where people have been living for 18 years and building something that doesn't appear on any of our maps." Bren was quiet for a moment. She had the quality of silence that thought in it rather than simply waiting. "You're going alone?" "Yes." "The council is going to notice your absence." "The council will be told I'm conducting a personal assessment of the fire damage to the northern timber reserves." "Which is true in the sense that I intend to go north, and the northern timber reserves are in fact damaged. That's a narrow definition of true." "I've been working with narrow definitions for 18 years, Calder said. "I've decided to try something wider." Bren looked at him for another moment. Then she turned to the maps. The next 3 years were not quiet years. Doran stabilized in the spring, following the Ridge confrontation. Not recovered, not restored to a health that would ever be uncomplicated, but stabilized in the specific way of someone whose body had found an accommodation with its own limitations and decided to continue on those terms. The fourth specialist had found the underlying cause in the previous year, and the treatment was not dramatic, and did not produce dramatic results, but it produced incremental ones, and incremental ones sustained over time were the only kind that lasted. He was 12 years old. He wanted to learn to ride. Calder watched him approach the task with the specific, patient determination of someone who had been told many times what he could not do, and had developed a comprehensive skepticism toward that category of information. He fell off the horse 4 times in the first week. He got back on each time with the expression of someone who had been given a problem and had not yet found a reason to consider it unsolvable. Calder watched this from the training yard wall and felt something that was not simple pride, because the situation was not simple, but that occupied the same territory. In the capital, the political situation underwent the gradual reconfiguration that political situations underwent when the underlying conditions changed, not dramatically, not through single decisive events, but through the accumulation of small shifts that eventually added up to a different arrangement. 2 of the 3 Eastern Lords returned to the quarterly sessions. The third was pursuing the Southern Federation alliance, with the focused determination of a man who had made a decision and was not interested in revisiting it. And Calder let him go, because forcing the issue would cost more than accepting the realignment. The council stopped meeting without him on succession questions. Not because the succession question had been resolved, but because the framing of the question had shifted from the immediate crisis of a failing heir to the longer-term strategic question of what kind of continuity the kingdom actually needed, which was a different conversation, and one that Calder could participate in without being primarily a liability to his own interests. He was working. That was the simplest description of the 3 years. He was doing the work that had been neglected while he had been spending his attention on things that were not, it turned out, the main problem. He was fixing things that had been broken for a long time. He was having the difficult conversations with the lords, who required difficult conversations. So, he was being honest in the council chamber in ways that occasionally produced immediate friction and consistently produced better long-term outcomes than the alternative. He was also going north, not continuously, not with the army, alone, with Bren's route, and a pack whose weight he had argued with her about, until she had pointed out that she had been doing this for 30 years, and he had been doing it for 3 months. And perhaps the argument had a natural resolution available. He went north 4 times in 3 years, penetrating progressively deeper into the territory above the mapped boundary. He was not looking for Rowan on these trips. He was learning the ground, the way she had learned it, by moving through it repeatedly until his body knew it, until the landscape stopped being abstract and became specific, until he understood what 18 years in this terrain had actually required of a person on a practical, daily, non-theoretical level. It was the hardest physical work he had done since the dire bear in the first winter of his reign. It was also the most clarifying. He went in the 4th autumn with a specific objective, and a specific thing in his pack, and a specific thing he had decided to say. When he found what he was looking for, which he spent the first 2 days of the journey, accepting that he might not find, because she had had 3 years to decide whether she wanted to be found. And she was, demonstrably, someone who could make herself unfindable. When that was what she had decided, on the 3rd day he found a marker. Not an obvious one. A specific arrangement of 3 stones at the base of a particular tree that matched a pattern he recognized from the tracking reports, and that he had learned, from 4 trips north, to read as intentional rather than accidental. On the 5th day he found the camp. The camp was not what he had expected, which told him something about the quality of his expectations. He had been thinking of it, despite his best efforts, in terms of what he knew. Camps as military installations, or hunting outposts, or temporary habitations. This was none of those things. It was a place where people lived, which was different in kind from a place where people stayed. The difference was visible in every detail, the way the structures related to the terrain, rather than imposing on it. The fire rings built to the specific depth that produced maximum heat with minimum smoke in this altitude's wind patterns. The food storage systems designed around the particular preservation challenges of this climate and elevation. Someone had been thinking carefully about every element of this place for a very long time. He stood at the edge of it and made no attempt at concealment, because concealment would have been both ineffective and dishonest, and he had traveled 5 days to be neither. The fire in the center of the camp was burning at a low, controlled level that threw heat without visible flame at more than 10 feet. Rowan was sitting beside it. She was not surprised. She had. He understood from her expression and her posture, been aware of his approach for some time, and had made a decision about it. And the decision had been to let him arrive, rather than to be elsewhere when he did. This was not the same thing as welcome. It was a conditional permission, and the conditions were not yet stated, and he was aware that they could be withdrawn at any point. He stopped at the edge of the firelight. She looked at him. He looked at her. Between them, the fire. The same fire she had been building for herself for 18 years. Patient, and controlled and sufficient and entirely her own. He sat down on the far side of it, not requesting permission, not performing the request for permission. Sitting, the way you sat, when you had finally arrived somewhere, after a very long journey, and the sitting was the most honest thing available. And the honesty was the only currency you had brought that was worth anything here. The Eastern Lords, Rowan said, not as greeting. As the resumption of a conversation that had been interrupted on a burning ridge 3 years ago, and had apparently been running in parallel since. In the way of important conversations that do not actually stop when the people having them separate. 2 of 3 returned. His voice was rough with 5 days travel. The 3rd aligned with the Southern Federation. I've let it stand, Doran, better. The word arrived with the weight of someone who had been afraid for a long time and was still adjusting to the partial lifting of it. Not uncomplicated, but better. He's learning to ride. She looked at the fire for a moment, nodded once, which was its own complete response. He reached into the pack beside him and set something on the ground between them. A folded document. The seal had been broken. He had opened it and read it himself, and was presenting it already knowing its contents, which was not how formal documents were usually presented, but was the only honest way to present this one. The mark on the broken wax was Valdenmore's official seal, pressed with the full authority of the crown. A charter, he said, for the Northern Territory. Defined borders, the ones that reflect what is actually here rather than what the maps currently show. Legal standing under the kingdom's authority. Governance rights held by the occupants. No taxation, no garrison, no council jurisdiction, no oversight. He met her eyes across the fire. Not payment for something, not a purchase. The formal acknowledgement that something has been built here that deserves the protections the kingdom can actually provide. And the honest admission that providing them cost me less politically than returning to the capital, having made no progress on the only thing that has mattered to me for 18 years. Rowan looked at the document, did not pick it up. What does it cost you personally? Her voice was level. The question of someone who had learned, over 18 years, to distinguish between the political calculus and the human one, and to require answers about both. He was quiet for a moment. Not managing the pause. Actually in it, finding the honest answer rather than the functional one. Admitting that the strongest thing running in my bloodline spent 18 years being built by someone else in territory I was not present for. Admitting that the choice I made at the altar had consequences I did not face and did not earn the right to avoid. He held her eyes. Admitting that I cannot resolve this, that I can only show up for what remains, and be honest about what I'm offering and what I'm not claiming, the fire between them, the pine dark beyond it. Somewhere in the trees, the particular sound of the camp's perimeter at rest, the sounds of a place that had been made right over a long time. I'll take it to Daxton and Lyris, Rowan said. It's their territory as much as mine, more, in specific ways. They decide whether the charter is accepted and on what terms, if any. Something moved across his face. Not relief. Relief would have been too simple for what was actually occurring. The specific expression of a man being told that the people who hold the thing he has traveled 5 days to offer are going to make the decision about it. And that this is correct, and that he has enough remaining honesty in him to recognize why it is correct and to accept it without negotiating toward a different arrangement. That's fair, he said. Yes, she said. It is, a sound at the camp's edge. Daxton came in from the eastern perimeter. He had been out there, she knew, since before Calder's arrival, watching the approach. He stopped at the edge of the firelight and looked at Calder with the same direct, unhurried attention he had brought to the ridge 3 years ago, not hostile, not warm. The careful regard of someone who had thought about this possibility for 3 years, and had come to a position on it, and was now conducting the reality against the position. Lyris came from the other direction, from the high rocks to the north, where she went, when she was doing her deepest thinking. She stopped beside her brother, both of them looking at the man sitting across the fire from their mother with the document between them. Calder looked at his children. He did not speak. He had learned on the ridge 3 years ago, and had been learning more thoroughly since. A specific kind of error that came from filling silence with words, when the silence was doing necessary work. He held still and let the moment be what it was. Imperfect, complicated, irreducible to any of the clean narratives that the council chamber demanded, and that the high country had no use for. Daxton crossed to the fire and sat down. Not across from Calder, at the angle that was neither aligned nor opposed, the position of someone who had decided to be present for a conversation, without having yet decided its outcome. He picked up the charter document. Read it. Set it back down. The borderline on the eastern section is wrong. he said. It follows the mapped river, not the actual river. The actual river shifted 12 years ago. The mapped version runs through the middle of the high camp. Calder looked at him. Show me. Daxton looked at his mother. Rowan met his eyes across the fire with the expression of someone watching something unfold that they had not arranged and were not going to interfere with. Lyra sat down on Rowan's other side. She looked at the document, at Calder, at the fire. She was running her own assessment on her own timeline, and she would reach her own conclusion, and it would be hers, which was the only kind that had ever counted for anything out here. The night settled around the camp. The fire burned at its low, controlled level. The peaks above them were invisible, in the dark, but present in the cold that came off them, patient and permanent, and entirely indifferent to what the humans below them were working out. The charter negotiation took 9 days, not because the document was particularly complex. It was 4 pages of formal language establishing what already existed and giving it the legal standing that formal language was designed to provide. It took 9 days because Dax found 4 additional errors in the border mapping that required correction, each one identified through the specific intimate knowledge of the territory that came from having lived in it and moved through it for 18 years, and knowing where the maps had been drawn from a distance by people who had not been there. Calder sat with the corrections and did not argue with them because they were correct, and because arguing with correct information was the habit of a man he was working to stop being. On the 4th day, Lyris asked him a question. They were sitting at the edge of the high camp in the early morning, while Daxton and Rowan were working the eastern boundary assessment. The question arrived without preamble, which was consistent with how she operated. She asked things when she had finished processing the relevant information and had arrived at the thing she actually needed to know. Did you love her? Not directed at him from across a distance. Asked from beside him, in the same tone she would have used to ask about wind direction or water sources. A practical question about a practical variable. He was quiet for a long moment. I told myself it was complicated. That's not what I asked. Yes, he said, in the way that people love things they don't fully understand and don't make sufficient effort to protect. He looked at the peaks above the camp. The complication was that I let the thing I was afraid of be larger than the thing I loved. That's not complexity. That's just a specific kind of failure. Lyris was quiet for a moment. She doesn't need you to have loved her. She's been fine, I know. I'm asking because I'm deciding what I think about you. And the answer matters to the decision. He turned to look at her. The amber eyes in her face, his, in the face she had built, from entirely different materials, regarding him with patient, comprehensive attention of someone who had been taught to look at things honestly and had been doing it since before she could speak. What did you decide? He asked. I haven't finished yet, she said. That's why I asked. She stood and walked back toward the camp. He sat with the answer, which was not an answer yet, which was more honest than an answer would have been, and let it be what it was. On the 9th day, the charter was signed. Not in a ceremony. Not with witnesses beyond the 4 people present. Daxton spread the corrected document on a flat rock near the fire, and Rowan read it completely, which took 20 minutes. And then she looked at her children, and they looked at her, and Daxton nodded once, and Lyris was still for a moment, and then nodded once, and Rowan signed it with the instrument Calder had brought for this URPSA, and Calder countersigned it with the Crown's authority, and the thing was done. Calder folded his copy, put it in his pack. He would register it with the kingdom's legal archive when he returned to the capital, which would produce a series of questions from the council that he had been preparing answers to for the past 3 years. The answers were honest. They were also strategically constructed, which was not a contradiction. Honesty about the what did not require full disclosure of the how, and the council would be given what they needed to do their function, and not invited to participate in the things that were not their function. He was staying for 2 more days. This had not been discussed explicitly. It had simply become apparent over the 9 days of the negotiation that two Surgas were available before the weather pattern that Lyris had been tracking Naik would close the northern passes, and that the 2 days would be used for the continuation of a series of conversations that had no formal agenda and no official record, and that were producing, incrementally, something that did not have a name yet and did not need one. Daxton had shown him the eastern boundary in person, walking the actual river course and explaining, with the patient thoroughness of someone who had learned every piece of this by direct experience, why it had shifted, and what the implications were for the drainage patterns in the high camp, and what adjustments had been made over the years to account for the change. He talked about the territory the way Calder talked about the political systems he had spent his reign managing, with the specific, granular fluency of someone who had been paying close attention to something for a long time, because the attention was not optional. Calder listened the way he had been learning to listen, without the part of his attention that was always preparing the response, without the overlay of what this information was worth to him strategically. Just listening, because son was something true, and the true thing deserved the full attention without the filter. On the last evening, Rowan sat beside him at the fire, not across from him. Beside him, which was different in the specific small way that different things were different out here, not dramatically, not with announcement, but with the simple factual significance of a position chosen rather than defaulted to. They sat in silence for a while. The comfortable kind, the kind that did not require filling, that two people could occupy together without either of them owing the other anything for the duration of it. "The council's going to ask about the northern boundary change," she said, eventually. "Yes, what will you tell them? That I conducted a personal assessment of the territory and found the existing maps to be inaccurate and corrected them." Which is true. He looked at the fire. That the Northern Territory has been a continuous occupancy and development for 18 years, and the kingdom's interests are best served by formal recognition of that fact. Which is also true. And when they ask who has been occupying and developing it, I'll tell them a name. He paused. "If you're willing to have a name on a legal document." She was quiet for a moment. "Rowan of the Northern Reach," she said. "That's what the name on the document should say." A pause. "It's what I've been for 18 years. It's accurate." "It is," he agreed. The fire between them burned at its low, patient level. Outside the camp, the high country was dark and cold and permanent in the way of things that had been there before any of the current occupants, and would be there after. The peaks above them held the early stars in the space between their edges. The wind moved through the pines in the frequency that Rowan had been falling asleep to, for 18 years, unchanged, unhurried. "You'll come back," she said. Not a question. A statement of something she had assessed and arrived at a conclusion about. "If you'll have me." She looked at the fire, at the camp around them, what she had built from the specific combination of nothing and intention over 18 years of daily, undramatic, cumulative work. At the peaks above, at the dark where her children were, somewhere in the perimeter, doing whatever they were doing on their own terms in their own time. "On terms we set," she said, "yes. In conditions that require you to carry only what you've earned. Yes. Then we'll see," she said. "That's the most honest answer I have." "It's enough," he said. And he meant it, not as a concession, not as a strategic acceptance of incomplete victory, but as a genuine statement of sufficiency. It was enough. The honest answer from someone who had earned the right to give it was enough, and he had spent 18 years confusing enough for insufficient. And he was done with that particular confusion. The fire burned. The stars moved overhead on their own unchanging schedule. The camp held its quiet. The quiet of a place that had been made right through sustained and serious effort, that matched the people living in it, that had been earned in the only way anything out here was earned. He had wanted heirs. He had built a dynasty on the premise of heirs. He had made the choice at the altar that he had calculated was most likely to produce the continuation he believed a king was obligated to secure. Across the fire, and across 18 years, and across the specific, concrete consequence of the specific, concrete choice had he made. Two people who carried his blood and his bone structure, and none of his assumptions were living the life they had built in the territory they had earned in the country that no one else had wanted, and that they had made into something worth wanting. The continuation had happened. It had simply happened without his permission, on a timeline he had not set, in conditions he had not provided, by means he had not arranged. Which was, he thought, watching the fire, exactly what it deserved. The sword stayed on his table when he returned to the capital. Not in the locked drawer. On the table, where he could see it. The locked drawer he eventually emptied, placed the torn cloak in the cedar chest with his field gear, where it belonged alongside the other things from the years of difficult work rather than the years of difficult avoidance. The charter was registered with the legal archive on a Tuesday morning, handled by a clerk who filed it without particular interest, alongside the other boundary adjustments from the Northern Assessment, which was exactly how Calder had structured the paperwork and exactly the level of attention he had intended it to receive. In the Northern Reach, the high camp relocated twice in the following decade, not from pressure, but from choice, moving to ground that suited the changing requirements of the people living in it. Daxton resolved the eastern boundary dispute with the adjacent territory through a negotiation conducted entirely on his own terms, and producing an outcome that the adjacent territory's senior lord dived afterward as the most efficient resolution he had encountered in 30 years of boundary work. He did not say this to Daxton directly, but the assessment reached Rowan through the same informal information networks that had always served her better than official channels. Lyris spent 2 years in the capital. Not permanent terms, for her own purposes, which she did not discuss extensively with anyone including her mother, which was consistent with how she had always operated. She returned to the Northern Reach with specific knowledge she had determined was worth acquiring, and with a view of the kingdom below that was now based on direct observation rather than inherited description. She and Calder developed a specific, unsentimental, mutually respectful working relationship that began with the border maps and extended over time into other areas where her particular quality of assessment was useful, and his access to the kingdom's institutional resources was useful in return. Neither of them called it anything. The absence of a name suited them both. Rowan turned 60 in the Northern Reach. On a morning, when the light came through the high camp, at the specific angle that happened in early autumn when the season was turning, but the cold had not yet fully committed, and the peaks above were clear, and the wind was clean, and the camp around her was exactly what she had built it to be. She did not make particular note of the occasion. She had never been interested in the mark of anniversary as a formal practice. The ongoing fact of a thing seemed more significant than the annual acknowledgement of its beginning. But she sat at the fire that morning, for a while, before the day's work began. She thought about the night she had walked through the gate and into the storm, and into the dark, and she thought about the 41 days before the stone hut, and the stone hut, and the years after it, and what they had required, and what they had produced. She had not planned any of it. She had planned the escape and the first winter, and the immediate contingencies. Everything after that had been response, intelligent, sustained, fully committed response to what the terrain actually was rather than what she had wanted it to be. She had not planned the wolves or the pack or the territory or the charter or any of it. She had planned, on the 41st night, to survive until morning. Everything else had followed from that, one day at a time, in conditions that had never been easy and had never been optional, and had never once been anything other than exactly what was required of her. Which was, she thought, looking at the peaks above the camp in the early autumn light, what the work always was, what it had always been. The daily, undramatic, cumulative decision to be where you were, and do what was needed, and build what could be built, and let the rest go. She got up. The day's work was waiting. Here's what I want to ask you, before we close. Have you ever made a choice that looked right on paper, that made sense to everyone around you, that checked every reasonable box, and then lived long enough to see what it actually cost? Calder had a crown. He had an army. He had the approval of every lord in the kingdom on the night. He placed that cloak on the wrong set of shoulders. He had done everything the way it was supposed to be done. And he spent 18 years in a room with a locked drawer, alone with the specific quality of silence that exists when you have traded something real for something manageable. Aaron had none of those things. She had a storm and a head start, and the bone-handled knife of a man who had failed her, which she kept anyway because pride did not skin rabbits. And she built something, not quickly, not dramatically, not in a single act of defiance or a single moment of triumph. Day by day, in conditions that did not care whether she survived, she built something that lasted. The first lesson is not about strength. It is about what you do with the decision after the decision. Calder's mistake was not the choice at the altar. People make wrong choices, and wrong choices are survivable. His mistake was the 18 years of living inside the wrong choice without doing the work to understand it. The locked drawer. The managed surface. The careful distance from anything that required him to look at what he had actually done. The second lesson is about what we call weakness. The council looked at Rowan and saw a scout with mud under her fingernails who had never learned to embroider tapestries. They did not see someone who would walk alone into a winter storm carrying 2 lives and come out the other side having built a territory from nothing. We do that constantly. We assess people at the surface, in the room, in the moment of presentation. We miss the walker in the storm. We miss the person carrying the thing they haven't told us about yet. The third lesson is the one that Daxton gave to Calder on the ridge, and it is the one worth sitting with longest. You gave up something you didn't know existed. That's different from giving up something you knew. Most of us don't lose things through malice. We lose them through the specific combination of fear and convenience that presents itself as reasonable decision-making. We choose the safe road because the right road looked too costly in the moment of choosing. And we tell ourselves it was complicated, and sometimes it was, and the complication is real. But the complication is not the same as absolution, and knowing the difference is the beginning of doing anything useful with what remains. What remains is always something. That is the last thing this story says, and it says it in the only way that actually works. Not as a statement, but as the accumulated evidence of 18 years of daily work in hard conditions. Something can be built from what remains, not the thing that was lost. Something different, if you do the work honestly and show up without the infrastructure of your old justifications, might turn out to be exactly what was needed. Have you ever made a call you couldn't take back? A moment where you chose the manageable thing over the true thing, and lived with it longer than you expected? Tell us in the comments. We're listening.